How is everybody? Has everyone got a drink? Is everyone okay?
I have. I'm happy.
Yes. John was saying, where's the beer? And he's presenting, so it should be a lively night, I suspect. My name is Guy Murphy. I'm the Worldwide Director of Planning here at JWT. I am no more than your host for tonight. So if this were X Factor, I am Dermot O'Leary. That's where the kind of resemblance ends, I think. Can I welcome all of you here tonight? It's lovely to see a big full room. Particular welcome, of course, to those who are here at JWT for the very first time, and a welcome back to many of you who know us well. We're very privileged to have some of our clients here as well who've taken some time out of their schedule. So particularly for everyone to know, we have clients here from HSBC, from Shell, from Kimberly-Clark, Pfizer, and WWF. I hope I've not missed anybody out, but very good to see you all here too, as well as the whole gathering. Tonight, what are we doing? Tonight, this is the launch of the Future Quotient report, so it's the world premiere. It's been co-written by JWT and Volans, and you're going to be hearing directly from the authors of the report tonight, who are standing to my left and to my right, and I will introduce them in a moment. Just very briefly, I just wanted to tell you why JWT were so keen to be involved with Volans and with the writing of this particular report. Many of you will know that JWT is, we believe, the oldest advertising agency in the world. And we have client relationships that go back many, many years, and we've been building brands for decades and decades. And many of those brands we still have. And I guess that long-term perspective that we have on brands is the overlap with this report. Because, as you will hear, the urge to think long-term, not short-term, about brands and business and so on is one of the key tenets of this. And that's where there's a kind of meeting of minds between JWT and Volans over this particular report. So that's why one of the reasons why we are so interested. But let me introduce the people who have created the content for you. To my right here, this is John Elkington, who is the co-founder and executive chairman of Volans. Welcome to you. To my left, we have Alistair Morton, who heads up JWT Ethos here in London. And to the left there, if you can just see her, we have Charmian Love, who is the chief executive of Volans. And these people are going to be presenting the kind of potted highlights of the report. It's going to last about half an hour or so, and then there's going to be some questions. So maybe prepare a question so there's not one of those awkward silences, so we can have some hands up. A bit of Q&A, and then what's always nice afterwards, we have a lovely bar upstairs with a kind of garden looking out over Knightsbridge and so on, where there's some food and some drink and a few kind of interactive surprises for you. So we would very much like to invite people to come up to the bar afterwards to sort of discuss what you've heard, and perhaps also to maybe even get a copy of the report itself. For those of you on Twitter, that's the hashtag, so please tweet about tonight or follow it thereafter. And with that, let me hand over to John.
I was told to jump up and down when I was about to speak, so that you would know when to speak. The microphone on. It's now on. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Couple of initial points. I do recommend the surprises later on, quite apart from the alcohol, and you'll hear a bit in a moment about what those surprises will be. Something I read a couple of days ago really stuck in my mind, and somebody was saying that when you have a war, the first casualty is truth. And in the same way, when you have a global downturn, one of the first casualties is the future. People just hunker down. They start to try and do what they've done traditionally, and they try and do it faster and cheaper and so on. Instead of going wide, they tend to sort of narrow down the focus. And it's also a bit like sort of people running. You know, the tendency is for your breath to get shorter and shorter, and you start to pant. And that's exactly what we do in a recession. We just get stressed and fearful, and we forget to go breathe deeper and actually think more deeply. We also tend to lower our targets. We tend to become significantly less ambitious, and our timescales absolutely sort of shrink. So we start to think in a much more short time horizon. And what you'll be hearing from us, I think collectively this evening, is that we have to push in exactly the opposite directions on each of those dimensions if we are to achieve what we think is going to be necessary, which is not incremental change, it's transformative, systemic change that we now need to get involved in. Now, just in case you suddenly get caught short or need to run off for a bus or whatever it happens to be, this is what you need to leave with. This is the report that we didn't put on your seats because Alistair didn't want you distracted by leafing through the thing, but this is what we want you to leave with. Plus, we want you to do a test. It will take a very short amount of your time. It's upstairs, but you'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. Next year, as many of you will know, is the, not only 2012, you know that, but it's the 40th anniversary of the Limits to Growth study. It's the 25th anniversary of the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future. It's the 20th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit. And you all know what's going to happen. People are going to convene in vast numbers, hopefully, and they're going to congratulate themselves on progress over the last 20, 25 years, whatever it is. And we have to celebrate the fact that people now know the language and to some degree using it. So, for example, I don't know whether Peter Lacey is here. No. I would say this whether he was here or not. But Accenture last year, many of you will have seen, did a study around the world for the UN Global Compact. And they interviewed 766 CEOs. And some wonderful results came out. So 93% of those CEOs said they now understand that sustainability, immensely important agenda. 88% said they now understand. I see Gib from Accenture here, but 88% said that they now know that they've got to drive this through their supply chains. And the real shock for me was that 81% of those CEOs said that they thought they had already embedded sustainability in what they do. And I think what we'll be getting into a little bit this evening is not a blame game, just simply saying it's wonderful that people have signed up for this journey, but we're not entirely sure that they totally understand what that journey is going to involve. And one of the absolutely crucial elements of the sustainability agenda is that it was always constructed, as you know, around the intergenerational equity agenda and intergenerational, very, very long time scales. Now, you'll see, oh God, Prezi. I'm going to get used to Prezi, but in 1968 I took LSD, and this is just reminding me slightly of all of that. But people in turbulent times, and I've just come back from Turkey, and I visited the site of a wreck that goes back into the early Bronze Age. And they would have used instruments like this, astrolabes. Later on we got to compasses and so on. And the idea of the work, the project that we've just done with JWT, is to try and develop navigational devices for senior decision makers, not just CEOs, other people in the C-suite and outside, and also policymakers, politicians, and so on, at a time of, we think, massively growing turbulence. In a sense, if you think you've seen a recession, you haven't really seen anything yet. It's our sense the next few years are going to see changes that are, at the moment, almost unimaginable. And in a sense, that's a horror, but at the same time, that's a massive opportunity. It's in exactly those times of our collective history where the really significant changes can happen. Now, many of you will, it's not just the beard, I have very strong peripheral vision. In the report, you will see a rather different version of this in the sense you'll probably be able to read it. And it just tracks from 1960 onwards, a series of societal pressure waves. And it continues on the second page to look forward into the future and some possible trajectories. This is broadly where we are. 2011, a bunch of stuff has happened, probably more stuff than in a normal year. Is that accidental, or is it that symptomatic of underlying changes? We think it's symptomatic. And if you then think about where we are in all of this, it's 50 years ago that I first got involved in the environmental movement. I was 11, I was at school, I raised money for WWF in its first year. what we were starting to do at that stage was change people's mindsets. And now people around the world understand that we have a problem, that sustainability and so on are aspirational, but where we are is unsustainability in many ways. One of the core elements of that challenge is that our behaviors are both dysfunctional in terms of the sustainability agenda and very, very difficult to change. So one of the reasons that we're delighted to be working with JWT is this is an area that the advertising agencies very much play into. When you look at why it is that people find it very difficult to change their behaviors, typically, and I'm sorry that those at the back of you can't see this at all, let alone clearly, there's a cultural lock-in. The culture just prevents, whether it's an organizational culture or a national culture or whatever it is, it just locks people in. And then most fundamentally of all, the paradigm that underpins everything else. And people love to talk about paradigm shifts in the formulation of toothpastes and so on. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about every 70, 80, 90 years, something fundamental happens in the way that we view the world. And my personal view, we're about 55 years into a paradigm shift, and you're going to see a massive acceleration in the processes of change. My final slide, though, is this one. And you've all seen innovation curves. You know, the point from which something wonderful comes along and Steve Jobs offers us whatever it is, the iMac or the iPad or whatever. But in time after time, we find ourselves in this sort of space where everyone is, to some degree, aware that change is coming, but they're buggered if they really want to go across that chasm. And I think that's where we are in terms of sustainability and the 2012 agenda. Now, one of the things that I hoped Alistair would have in his presentation was some images from India of living bridges, where some of you may have seen them, where generation after generation people train creepers and roots and so on across chasms and valleys and so on, teach the new generation how to do that. And the result is a living bridge. And I think that was one of the 50 examples that came through in our 50 stars. So now what I'd like to do is hand over to Ali. But before I do that, I just want to say a series of thank yous. I'd like to thank JWT for their partnership in this project. It's been immensely constructive. I think we've enjoyed that immensely. I'd like to thank the Volans team, a number of whom are here today, including a member of our advisory board, Herta von Stiel, and the members of the project advisory group, a number of whom are here, and the people who pitched in on some of the working sessions. I wanted to thank in the front row John Fury of Mindtime Technologies from the US. You'll be hearing a bit about their technology in a moment, because it was serendipitous. Very late in the process, we stumbled across what they're doing, and it's become quite integral now to what we're doing. And then finally, but most importantly of all, because it wouldn't have been possible without them, I'd just like to thank the sponsors. So Atkins, represented here this evening, the Dow Chemical Company, also represented, and the Shell Foundation. Thank you all immensely for your support of this project. At which point, over to you, Ali. And I've probably completely exceeded my time scale, but there we are. That's all right. Thank you.
Wow, what a challenge. We sit there with a chasm in front of us, and there's business imperatives to try and cross it. There's a sustainability imperative to try and cross it. And what we need, therefore, is a paradigm that takes account of the needs and interests of future generations. That's why we're here. And our answer to that is to propose a concept which we're calling the Future Quotient. So this is a thing that would measure people's abilities to act and think on long-term horizons. So what you've heard is the why. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the thinking of the what and the who in that. So who's doing it well and what are we thinking? And Charmian's going to tell you about the what are you going to go and do now? How can we implement this? So we're not going to give you a future quotient. We're not going to be able to give people here a number. But what we can give you is those pieces of a map that take us towards a thing that we think is vital at this time, which is a way of understanding and improving our ability to think for the long term. So to do that, we wanted to really understand the lay of the land. And we reached out to the Volans network and experts within JWT and our parent company, WPP, to interview thought leaders in this space. So business leaders responded. We also had NGOs, social enterprise investors. We had a whole gamut of experts at this sort of thing. And we asked them, how are we going to get better at this? What are the questions we can answer? And specifically, the answer was resounding, that 98% of them think that operating for the long term is very important. This is just a resounding fact. It needs to improve. But equally, as John pointed out, there's a big difference between mindsets and behaviours, and some of the data showed that as well. So we asked them, for individuals, businesses, investors and governments, are these people getting better at thinking for the long term, and are they getting better at acting for the long term? And this is the aggregation of the results. So those things on the bottom of the chart, on the right-hand side of the chart, are getting better at thinking for the long term, and those people at the top of the chart are getting better at acting for the long term. Sadly, there's no one at the top of the chart. And they're all at the bottom, and you probably can't all see, but take a look to your left. So actually, what we found here is a couple of things. I mean, there's a little bit of pessimism about our ability to think for the long term. There's a lot of pessimism about our abilities at the moment to act for the long term. But it also proves one other thing. This isn't a one-dimensional problem. We can't just push people to think longer term, because even if we do, they won't necessarily be able to act long term. So the question we asked ourselves is, how can we get people to move up here? What is the future quotient, the thing that shows that people belong up here and are sitting up here? But if it's not one-dimensional, what are the dimensions? And now we get to kind of a pivotal observation in the report, really, based on our understanding of this, our asking of experts, our survey, and desk research. And we found actually that there's 5 dimensions that high FQ leadership must take into account. These are the dimensions that high FQ leaders show stretch in, and I will talk through each of them in turn. But this is, just to make the point, this is what goes on to form our understanding of a toolkit that you'll hear later from Charmian, and also just forms the sense of kind of commonality in the report. This is the pivot point which gets us to what would high future quotient look like. So what we're saying is that actually those people who do get into that top right-hand corner of the last chart you saw have stretch across 5 dimensions. The first of those is the dimension of change. So from incremental changes to systemic changes. And at a time, as John highlighted, when there's a great turbulence in the world, incrementalism isn't going to get us a long way. We need to understand the rules that govern how we operate as brands, as businesses, as individuals. And one example we pick up on this is Airbnb. So Airbnb partner people who have rooms to let with people who want a room for the night. So be it because they're on holiday or just in another city. And Airbnb, by next year, will have as many rooms on their books as Hilton globally. So what you find is someone who said, no, the rules of the game might be about owning bricks and mortar and getting people to pay to stay there, but they've found another way to play that game, and that's a systemic change that we see. The second dimension that high FQ leaders stretch along is a dimension of scope, from narrower to wider. So what we mean by this is the scope of the landscape that you place yourself in. Who are the people who are your potential collaborators, threats? Where do your opportunities lie and where do your impacts lie? An example of this quite close to home is LOCOG, so the London Organising Committee of the Olympic and Paralympic Games for next year. And they put sustainability in a lot of their procurement decisions. So they've understood a width of what their impacts are, not just within London, but across the world. And by doing that, they've allowed themselves to have zero ambitions. So not zero ambitions, ambitions for zero in how they send waste to landfill and develop the games next year. So those are the first 2 dimensions. I'm sorry, they're at the bottom here. But the next dimension is one of analysis, so from shallower to deeper. I think with the increasing globalization, with these flurries of data we have around us, it's very easy to be pushed into shallow analysis of the problems and challenges we face. But what we're arguing for is a need for deeper understanding in those places where it's right for you. So Puma, when they came across and put together their environmental profit and loss accounts this year, did that in abundance. They understood that actually the environmental services that they get as a business account for about 100 million euros worth of value. And they've understood deeply what that value is, where it lies, and what they can do about that. The fourth dimension is one of ambition. I think this kind of speaks for itself, but from low ambition to high ambition, how can we stretch across that? And Unilever and Paul Polman is one of our examples that we pull out. He talks about dragging the world back to sanity, and he does this through high ambitions, which have the power to change. And the final dimension is the time dimension, but as I said, that can't be the only dimension. So in terms of timescale, thinking from shorter to longer, and you get wonderful projects around this. The Long Now Foundation is building a clock in the Nevada hills, which they want to chime for the next 10,000 years. And they've built it, there's kind of a wonderful idiosyncrasy. They built it so that every time it chimes a different tune. So no one for the next 10,000 years will hear the same tune from this clock. So we've gone from saying we need to get people to think longer term to actually saying, but there's 5 dimensions that are going to be the things across which we need to stretch if we're going to get this thinking and acting long term. Now, if these are ambitions, we also asked our research panel, what are the characteristics that people exhibit when they manage to stretch across these 5 dimensions? And you'll find them in the report distilled as the 7 Cs. So these are the characteristics, if you like, that people who manage to do this tend to exhibit. And I've talked a lot about the who, so I've mentioned a number of examples. In the report, we also pick up on 50, what we're calling high future quotient stars. These are some of them. I've already mentioned a lot of these as well. But these are the people who we should almost treat as our guiding lights, our stars in the sky. They're not the only ones we could have chosen. There's probably people who deserve to be on there who aren't on there. But these are examples that we can all look to and think, well, what if I did something a little bit like them or a little bit like them? And I think they provide an interesting kind of sense of guidance for us. And I'm going to reveal one of the interactive bits. Upstairs, we've sought to understand them and their data that they produce. So this is a map, and you can read it upstairs. You're not meant to be able to read it. Of the keywords that feature alongside our high future quotient 50 in The Guardian. So we've taken their API, visualized the keywords that feature among them. And you'll find a couple of other visualizations upstairs that try and unpick what these people are doing right, who they're connecting with, how wide their scopes are. So if that's the what and the who of this thing that we want to pitch to you, a future quotient, this is some of the building blocks that take us towards understanding what that should be and how we can begin to measure it. And I'll pass over to Sharmi now for the how.
Great, thanks, Sally. I'm going to ask John to make the sound effects as I go and use Prezi.
I'm not.
Whoa, cool. So I get a fun job because I get to talk about the how, the action that's about this report. When we first started talking about it, I think the ambition was always not for this to be a report that would stay on paper. The idea behind this was how can we take the insight that we're uncovering through a range of really interesting interviews, surveys, conversations, desk research, and actually frame it in a way that would allow the reader to act on it. That's a challenge because usually people take reports and they read it and then they put it away somewhere. And so very much in our goals when we were setting them up front, I'm sort of looking at my 2 colleagues on the side here, so hopefully they're nodding their head. The goal was how can we use what we're learning as a tool to open people's minds, to be provocative in a time where we need that provocation, as well as to hopefully influence the way people think and act. And that's something that I think both John and Ali have mentioned. We were really lucky that we came across some really interesting people and tools like MindTime, as well as different models. And what I'm really excited to share with you tonight as part of the action or the how you can start thinking and acting long term are 3 different things. So if you walk away and think about how this report can translate into action, 3 things. First is MindTime. MindTime, John's already introduced it, and I would encourage everyone to come speak to John Furry, who's interested in this model, in our reception upstairs. MindTime is about this triangle, but also so much more. It's a way of mapping how you or your team relate to the world of time, be it in the present, the future, or the past. In the report, what you'll see is an instruction manual on how you can start thinking along these lines, as well as how you can interpret them as both an individual and a team. But I wouldn't want you to just stop at the report, although what I'm really excited about is that you can actually take your pen pencil or whatever it is and start marking up the report, because you can actually start marking where you are on this triangle when you see it. But don't stop there, because we really want you to go to the MindTime website. And again, there's terminals upstairs where you can start playing around with this. This is a series of questions that you can answer that, again, can help place where you are. And this is really important to us for the phase 2 of the Future Quotient project, which we are also very excited about. The second thing that you can do starting tonight, it's part of the surprise that we've sort of trailed a few times. It's always worrying to say surprise, because then everyone's expectations are really high. But this is actually really, really cool, because what Ali's talked about are these 5 dimensions of leadership, and what we have highlighted in the report and we have for you upstairs are a series of prompts of how you can start stretching your abilities as a leader on these different dimensions. So there's a range of activities that are on boards. For example, under scope, and if you want to start thinking and acting more widely, there's an activity up there that you can do, which is to draw yourself or your organization in the community in which you live or operate. The trick here, I love this trick, is that you're not supposed to put yourself in the middle. So it's a challenge, because you're supposed to map who are the different customers, suppliers, family members, community members you interact with. But again, you're not in the middle. If you want bonus points, try and find some extra people that you don't think other people who are in your direct community might directly add onto that stakeholder map. So that's just one example of the kinds of activities we have upstairs. Again, these are the 2 ways you can start tonight. Start thinking about how you can think and act with longer term horizons in mind. A little bit more long term is when you actually are on the tube home or in a cab or walking, hopefully not walking, but when you have a moment, we want you to really look through the report and look at what we've called the playbook. And what the playbook is are 28 models and tools we've uncovered through these amazing interviews and research we've done over the last couple of months. Some of them, as I say, are tools. They're things that you can very specifically do if you're an investor. Things like start having a conversation with your LPs or your fellow investor community about what discount rate you're using. There's some more information in the report around the importance of discount rates when we have these conversations about the future and how we're valuing it. Another thing that I like, and Ali's already mentioned this, is the amazing role that we feel at Puma's had in setting some leadership around quantifying things that currently don't have a price tag attached to them today. So as an investor, try and think about what are the things that you are not quantifying or you're not putting a price on that will tomorrow, potentially. For example, water or your carbon footprint. For businesses, if you're in the business community and you want to start thinking how you can unlock your FQ leadership, one of the things that it was interesting, it came up from 2 of our advisory board members, unrelated. So they each brought this up to our attention separately. And that was around the importance of having intergenerational dialogues within your organization. And so an intergenerational board, or a generational board that actually transcends what we usually see. DSM, a really interesting company, has a Gen Next advisory board. Now that's a really interesting action that businesses could take to start getting the voice and the thinking of young people into the activities that they're planning in their strategies. There's a whole bunch of other ones for businesses. I think the other one that I would really highlight is around the importance of gaming. I think we all sort of talk about social media, engaging people in the questions that a high future quotient leader needs to be asking and the decisions they need to be making. They need to be interactive and they need to be involving a lot of people. So gaming is another tool to consider. Finally, for governments, funnily enough, we only found a couple of tools for governments, but I think this is a really important one just to highlight. What we were really interested to find were there are actually some governments out there that are organizing ministries of the future, cabinet officer of the future. This is really interesting because this is a way that governments can start getting the voice of the future stakeholders that they should be really planning for into the decision making they're doing. So those are just a few examples of what you'll see in the report in terms of the playbook, but the reason why this is really important is really just to reinforce this report is not meant to be just a series of words on paper. It is really meant to be something that inspires you and the people that you're able to share some of the information you've received from this report with into thinking and acting differently and with this future quotient in mind. we're really excited about the report. I'm kind of glad that Ali didn't put them all on your chairs, because I think it'll mean you'll have something really exciting to sort of flip through when you get upstairs. I would say that this is phase one of what we really hope is going to be a multiple phase project, so that we can really get closer at what that future quotient is. And there's a lot of partners in the room that we're really excited to continue working with. But my request of all of you here in the audience is, as you read the report, as you experiment with it, as you play with it upstairs, please let us know feedback, so we can use that and build on that as we sort of develop what these next phases are going to look like. I know there's some issues with BlackBerry right now. So I'm not sure how much people have access to Twitter, but that's one way that we're really keen to capture some feedback. So it's not just about also giving it just to us, but let's make it open source. So I would really highlight what Guy had said earlier, which is, hashtag Future Quotient. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Guy, because I think hopefully we still have some time for a little bit of Q&A. Excellent.
Thank you very much. That was a great piece of advertising for the report. Genuinely. So there is some time for questions. And now's the time when you kind of put your hand up and go, yes, I now want to ask a question. So I'll give you a few seconds to think of one. Just a point of clarification for me and maybe others. So the future quotient doesn't exist yet, does it? This is a pitch to have a thing called a future quotient.
Precisely. I mean, just like, I think I'll be turned on. I mean, just like an IQ or an EQ, emotional intelligence, or EcoQ even, ecological intelligence. This is something that we would like to become a tool when you're talking to your investors or to your consumers or to your customers. And if we could get to that thing that measures it in detail with credibility, then I think that would be a valuable tool going forward. And this is the pitch and some steps in that journey towards getting towards that. So we hope people will think of it conceptually as a valuable piece of thinking, and something that in a few years' time would be great to have in our grasps.
Yeah. I mean, I use the astrolabe partly because it's in the report, but another instrument that we talked about during the process was a kaleidoscope. So we've picked 50 initiatives, projects, individuals that strike us as really interesting in terms of emergent forms of leadership. But you could shake the kaleidoscope and you could do it from Indonesia, or you could do it from Brazil, and you get a very different set of results. And it's been really funny. I think Ali, you said earlier on that this is our first selection. I've been kicking myself in a couple of meetings just yesterday and today, because I keep coming across other things. I thought, I just wished we'd known about those and been able to slot them in. But just to give you one quick example, we've heard some favorites from the others. We also thought about fireflies in a jam jar. We've collected some things that look rather sort of exciting and sparkly to us. But one of them that's in there, I stumbled upon when I was with the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. And it's right in front of our noses. And it's the Thames Barrier. And if you look at how that barrier was designed, very explicitly they took into account the needs and requirements of the future generations, but also the capacity of current generations to pay. And so they very explicitly came up with a design which was modular and which could expand over a period of time as the capacity to pay built, hopefully, and as the risk perceptions evolved. And so part of what we're just trying to do here is to say, look at that, and look at that, and look at that. And they're all in different ways addressing this issue of the long term. And we think that's important because at the moment, as I said right at the beginning, we're all hunkering down, we're all becoming shorter term. And this is actually saying, don't necessarily imagine that that's the best way forward, and here are some clues on how to do it better. I'm sure someone's got a comment or, yes.
Can we take the gentleman in the middle there?
Getting to the place that we feel we need to innovate. We're fed up of hearing about the issues. We know the issues. We know the backdrop, and we want to know how to innovate. I mean, as it happens, WWF is launching our own report around innovation next week, which is very different to this, but hopefully quite complementary. I suppose one of my questions is a lot of the other discussion that's happening at the moment is around when future-proofing is a pre-competitive issue versus being a competitive issue. And is there anything around the report, or have you sort of thought about when does a company think we've got to collaborate for the good of our own business, and then there's a point where actually we need to go out on our own to think about, striding out?
Fantastic. I mean, shall I have a first stab at it? I mean, Puma was mentioned as a company that have gone into the environmental profit and loss space, and quite innovative and imaginative and courageous. But just a couple of weeks ago, we were involved with a whole series of sportswear brands who are under intense pressure from Greenpeace at the moment, with the Greenpeace Detox initiative. And without wishing to give too much of it away at the moment, because it's still under wraps to some considerable degree, the brands are being pressured by Greenpeace to put pressure, particularly on China, to detoxify the manufacturing sector there. And it's not giving away too many secrets to say that there was a very big difference of opinion with the brands, Adidas, Nike, Puma and others, there, about what the best way forward would be, whether they should use zero language or not. So I think we have to, Greenpeace there have been trying to get a competitive element into this, and that's a good way of getting it started. But to your point, I think WWF with MSC, Marine Stewardship Council, Forestry Stewardship Council, and so on, has built constellations of actors across sectors and across value chains. And I think increasingly that's what we need to do, but it's bloody difficult. It really is, as you know, at WWF.
Can I maybe just add to that a little bit? Because I think what we're talking about is the pre-competitive or competitive nature, and that ultimately can be guided by the leadership. And I mean, I think from the people we've talked to and the organizations we've looked into, those that seem to get the future-proofing agenda now, so I don't know if you would count that as pre-competitive or competitive. I think it's pretty competitive right now, but those who get it are usually people that are incredibly impassioned at that leadership level. And so there's been risks that some of those leaders have taken in order to embed that into the organization. And I think we have seen some of that leadership in, for example, the coalition and the collaboration building that's happening. But I think we really do need to see it as crystallized as the leadership in order to figure out, how do we make it happen?
Am I allowed to make a comment as well? There's a kind of a difference between competitive and pre-competitive and collaborating or not. So I think some of the most interesting examples we have within the brand world actually are collaborations which are competitive. So if we can talk to our brands and can you collaborate with a social enterprise which you might not previously have thought of, or an NGO or whatever. I think it's just worth making the distinction between those two dimensions, if you like. And collaboration is really exciting, even if it is at a kind of competitive level.
Question to the right there.
Yes, hi, good evening. I'm Claire Woodcraft from Shell Foundation. Hi, John, Ali, Sharmian. It was great to work with you on the project, and congratulations on the excellent output. We're extremely pleased and proud to be involved with this. Just a couple of points from me, and some of which I shared with you earlier. I think the first is around the comment from WWF. And in fact, yesterday we were having a conversation with our other partners of Ashridge Business School around sustainability, and how can we get across the concept of sustainability as being a public good. And I think that's something that we can all do more about. Because
I've had an email from them today. Now I know who to blame, Claire.
Yes, that might have been my fault. But the other point that I wanted to mention was, for me, my concern about attending forums around sustainability is I always have this feeling that we're preaching to the converted, and it worries me a lot, because I'm sure that probably most of the people in this room have really high FQ already, which is fabulous, but how do we get that across into the broader mainstream? We've got some great examples of the Unilevers of this world and the Pumas, but how do we, as we at Shell Foundation are focused, how do we get scale of impact? Because it's great, and maybe that is just a natural process, you reach a tipping point, but is there anything that we can do collectively as a collaboration to fast track that scale? Thank you.
Any thoughts?
I'm tempted to reveal one of the challenges that I put forth to our team when we first started writing this report. And my challenge was, can we write it without using the word sustainability in it? We found that would have been difficult, because obviously a lot of the upfront framing is around this sustainability agenda needs to be addressed, and we need to strengthen it going into the complex times that we're going into now. But part of that challenge, Claire, was about trying to address that, which is how do we make this something that is obviously about the principles of sustainability, especially as those articulated in Brundtland, which was the intergenerational importance of it. But make it something that is readable to people who don't go to sustainability conferences. Maybe they have a sustainability report, but that's sort of the limit of what they do. My hope is that what we've done in the report is framed the key messages in a way that make it, to the point Dax made, competitive and pre-competitive. It's about how do you build something that will make sure that your organization is resilient, a going concern, and is prepared for a longer term horizon. So my hope is that in the language we've tried to embed through the report, we are making it more accessible to those people. I think the fear we have is that the examples we've pulled, we've tried to find those that are the unusual suspects, but that's part of what phase 2 is getting more and more people to engage their networks and help us find examples that are not necessarily defined as sustainability, and use that as a tool to widen out the scope for what we're doing.
It may just be worth saying that culture change, which is in the third box in that matrix that I showed, tends to be quite protracted. It tends to be quite painful. So just to take one example, I was reading earlier on this morning about Solyndra, the US solar company that's just bitten the dust, having taken in, I think, about $500 million of federal funding before it went down. And some statistics, and I'm going to get them wildly wrong, were given in the piece. And it was saying basically if you go back a few years, the US would have controlled, I don't know, it might have been a quarter of the solar economy. People here will know it better. It's now 6%. And China, that had a very, very low share, is now at 40% of the solar economy. I can check the figures, but the point that was crystal clear was the reason it comes back to government. You look at the amount of money that has gone in from the US government and from the Chinese government into solar in particular, and it's 30 times greater in China than it is in the United States. And so my answer, Claire, is yes, this is preaching to the choir to some degree, and we must use every possible way that we can to open it out. But actually there's some really brutal changes coming at us. Actually, as it happens, China is one of the stars with their latest 5-year plan, not because we think they're even in scratching at the underside of the iceberg of perfection, they're not, but they're waking up to a set of strategic natural resource and environmental challenges and beginning to address that in an appropriate structural way. So I think reality is going to drive a lot of this, and I think we've got to be prepared when those shocks come, and they inevitably are coming, to be in there very quickly with positive, proactive, collaborative solutions rather than the alternative. Every time you have one of these periods where change goes off the scale, you get extremist politicians, and they'll be in there pushing protectionism, they'll be pushing xenophobic reactions. You begin to see this already in Europe. So a slight distraction from the question, but I think reality is catching up with us pretty quickly. Nigel.
Nigel Topping from CDP. I just wondered
Carbon Disclosure Project.
The Carbon Disclosure Project. Although we might soon just be CDP because it's too narrow.
Makes you sound like a Soviet space agency or something.
I'd just like to hear your thoughts on the importance of stamina, because it seems to me it's quite easy to think long term. It's also easy to act long term for a while.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult to keep going and going and going and going. And so a lot of examples of long-term thinking and acting can often be they can literally be sparks which die very quickly because there's a lack of stamina. And a lot of innovation talk focuses on the creative aspect and forgets the execution, which is required to bring the new into life. And when it's long-term, I just want to know how you see stamina in the kind of framing that you've adopted.
One of the 7 C's that we pick up on as kind of characteristics of these people with high FQ is courageous. And the key words we got to from that was stamina, actually one of them. So I think it's a problem we've witnessed. I'm not sure we've fully answered it. But I wonder if things like the width of network and collaboration and connection give you a sort of resilience against fatigue and against kind of changes of leadership or whatever it is. So hard question. We haven't answered it, but I think there are ways in which you can create that resilience.
A couple of reactions. One is to the sparks point. Every time you have an industrial revolution, you have a multiplicity of experiments to play into the new area of possibilities. So you go back to Henry Ford's time, and yes, there was Ford, but there are at least 100 other pretty substantial automotive engineering and production companies at the same time, most of which died. And you saw that in IT, you saw that in biotechnology. And the leaders who come through all of that are the ones partly with vision, but partly with stamina, but also partly, in some ways, they're nightmares to work with. And many of you will have been reading Steve Jobs' obituaries. I've been really digging into them. And there's one example of how he operated, which just comes to mind. I mentioned the iPad earlier on. Many of you will remember what he did when he was presented with the first iPad, which was significantly bigger than the one that finally came out. He walked across it. He's just sat there for a while looking at it. And then he walked across his office and he dropped it into the fish tank, the goldfish tank. And a stream of bubbles came out of the machine. He said, bubbles, space. Just go away and do it again. And so I think the leaders are, sometimes nightmares to work with, but they're people who just will not give up and push the system. And actually, I think most of our big incumbent companies are just wildly ill-suited to what's coming at us. So part of the reason I think we have to look at the margins increasingly is the really disruptive changes are starting to pop up in some rather unexpected places. But Tony, would you?
Tony, front, yeah.
Sure. Tony Pickett from JWT Canada. It's really just following up on the point that was raised. I wonder if the panel can comment on the importance of the demand side of the equation. You talk about the sustainability of this, and it conjures up the need for support, whether that's within a corporation or within a society. And I think Steve Jobs, as much of a pain in the ass that he was, created a vision at the same time and enrolled people on a very emotional level. So I wonder if you could comment on the role of it, that is the demand side, and what leaders can do to create it.
Should I have a quick first stab? I mean, in the late 1980s, some of you will be aware, we did a book called The Green Consumer Guide. It sold 1 million copies in 18 months. It was part of a movement where consumers around the world became aware of issues like ozone depletion. And for a period of time, 3-4 years, consumers were prepared to push. The older I get, and I get excited about Good Guide and all of these sort of mobile phone apps and so on. The older I get, the more I think we have to make this ultimately invisible to people. That, we can't expect them to make choices with sustainability priorities in mind every minute. They won't. So we've got to build infrastructures. We've got to build systems that make it invisible to them. But to get there is this immense period of change that we've got to go through. And it's got to become much more painful to people. And that isn't always to individual consumers. It's the people who supply them. It's the companies like Walmart or whoever it happens to be. But other thoughts?
I have a similar. Oh, do you want to move on?
I was actually, can I just judge the mood of the room? Can I just get 2, 3, 4 quick comments from some people? Not necessarily questions to these guys, just reactions to what they've heard or worries or concerns or delights they have. Could you just throw your hand up and let's just get 3 or 4 comments on what people have heard. Lady Tiffany.
Let's do from London 2012. Just not with the London 2012 hat on at all, but to me, it's talked about over and over again. Sustainability community. It's the MBA leaders of the future. It's the short-termism of the city. I've mainly worked in business, and I'm intrigued, and maybe it's going to be a few more reports down the line as to how business can really make this shift. Because until you've got some of those FQ leaders in business, that shift is a challenge, especially as you say, the leaders right now are hunkering down and going to be for some time and maybe not taking the big risks. So not meaning pessimism, but just the opportunity has to be in academic and city, in my view.
Gentleman just behind you. Thank you.
Hi there, it's Scott from the Long Run Venture, so props for taking the long run view. My observation actually is one of being really excited about what I've heard tonight, and I'm intrigued by with the surprises that sit upstairs for us. But we're doing a bit of work at the moment for the Technology Strategy Board, which is around future cities and the set of challenges and opportunities that are facing cities. And I wondered whether in your 50 there is a city, or indeed whether any of the tools or techniques that you've got could apply to places like cities.
Do you want to quickly answer that one, and then we'll couple more comments? Anything?
I don't think there's cities, but there's countries. And we've specifically mentioned that it would be great to measure an FQ of a city. You can imagine infrastructural dimensions and kind of cultural dimensions, social, environmental. I think that'd be a fab kind of route to take this.
There are also companies who are playing into the city trajectory. So Siemens is there, and they're building their entire corporate strategy around now supplying the infrastructure needs of cities. We thought about C40, the constellation of different cities, a bunch of other things, but couldn't actually find in the end. Curitiba came to mind, but we felt that was slightly tired in a way. Not that they aren't doing wonderful work. New York, with Mayor Bloomberg, also came up. I think a lot of this is going to happen at the city level, but I was at a launch yesterday of something called the Ecological Sequestration Trust, and the point was made, we've got to think about cities, but we've got to think about these complexes of urban centers with rural areas. It's not just the cities themselves, it's the agricultural and other resource hinterlands that they're part of. But would love to continue the conversation, Scott.
Just got time for one more comment before you want to take the others upstairs. Just gentlemen here.
Hi, Luke Nicholson from Carbon Culture. I hope this is going to be good enough. Thank you. So I think it's great to come to a place where people are kind of hoping that leaders are going to change, or that leaders are going to behave differently. And I wonder, and Shah mentioned games, and I wonder about the incentives that are driving leaders, the CEOs and the people in the C-suite, why it is, we certainly notice in the work that we're doing that 5 to 10% of most populations will engage with this, and everybody else, for the most part, won't. So, there's a question about how do you broaden this out to the whole of the C-suite? How do you broaden this out to all leaders? What do you think their incentives are? How do you think the incentives can be transformed, or the games can be changed, such that we can involve many more senior executives across the world in this agenda?
I mean, that's a question. So shall we just quickly?
Yes.
No, I'll just do a quick one because I think the games are an area that I'm really interested in. And what I would say is that if the 5 to 10% you see engaging with them, I think we got to remember generations and demographics are dynamic. So we're getting more and more young kids coming up, and those young kids are used to using games as their tools for interactivity. So I think that number is just naturally going to skyrocket as people get older and their roles within companies become senior and they're moving more through, and these are the tools that they're used to. So sadly, I think it'll be organic, but I think we can do a lot of things to move that forward.
The 5 to 10% I was talking about, the people who engage with sustainability and change their behavior around sustainability and games
is a different number.
So can I just say something very quick, and it's partly to Felicity's point and so on. Reports do not change the world. And in fact, I think if we can get a community online, even those don't really change the world. They catalyze change. They give people a sense of mutual identity and so on. We should all drop our glasses at that moment to give that sense of mutual identity. But let me just say, and it goes back partly to Claire's question as well. Sometimes you look in the wrong place. You look at the 5 to 10%, can we drive that to 50 in consumers or whatever, and tip the system. That isn't typically, and Steve Jobs knew it, where really dramatic changes tend to come from. And if you look at Afghanistan, every 50 fuel convoys result in 1 dead soldier or somebody who's very severely wounded. The US Department of Defense are now looking at that and thinking, that's the environment for the next 40 to 50 years. And so they're starting to think, how do you take the military off-grid? Now, I don't think biodegradable bullets or stealth fighters that are run on biofuels or whatever it happens to be are the answer to all of our collective prayers. But you're starting to see the military and the people who supply them becoming really seriously and stealthily, to some degree, interested in all of this sort of stuff. So we should be paying attention to where the change is really starting to happen. got to make it democratic. We've got to make it accessible to ordinary consumers and so on. But I think we're at one of these points where 10 years from now we'll look back and think, why didn't we see these things coming at us so powerfully? Not just the problems, but the solutions as well.
Okay, we should take this debate upstairs. Can I thank the three speakers very much indeed?
You can. Thank you.
Congratulations on the report. I think it's outstanding. The copies are upstairs, I believe, for people to grab one, plus drinks, food, a garden, and anything else you fancy. Thank you very much all for coming.
Thank you, guys.